everyone, and welcome back. I'm Rick Fussell, and this is the Ingrain Workshop, where the projects are classic and the tools are sharp. In today's video, we're going to be making a marking gauge. Now this little tool is a must-have for clean joinery and accurate layout lines, and we're going to be building it from scratch, sort of. That's coming up next here at the Ingrain Workshop. Starting with a piece of black walnut that's 2 inches square and about 6 inches long. For the end of this marking gauge, I'll be using a 5/8 inch brass gas flare fitting that I picked up at one of the big box stores. I'll begin by laying out all the components on the black walnut to make sure everything fits the way I want it. That's one of the perks of making your own tools. You can tailor them exactly to your needs. Once I've marked the location of the brass flare, I'll lay out where the threaded brass insert will go. Then using my fingers as a natural guide, I'll mark out the position for the brass faceplate. I went ahead and cut out the brass insert. It's 2 inches square and the thickness is 1/8 of an inch. The overall length of the handle from the brass flare cap at the end to the brass faceplate at the other end is exactly 3 inches long. I'll need to adjust the depth of the brass threaded insert, so here I'm going to use the steel beam as a guide to lay out the depth I'm going to need for the brass insert. For the handle curves that fit between my fingers, I'm using a 3/4 inch circle template, though a 3/4 inch washer would work just fine. To shape the transition into the faceplate, I'm switching to a 1 1/8 inch circle template to sketch that larger convex curve. The key components for the marking gauge, the steel beam, threaded brass insert, knurled brass knob, and the circular cutter blade all come from a kit I picked up from Taylor Toolworks. They're not a sponsor of this video, but definitely a good resource if you're looking to build your own. The kit includes 2 threaded inserts, just in case you mess one up, and 3 cutter blades. Later in the build, I'll put those extra parts to good use. With the layout complete, I'll head over to the table saw using my crosscut sled. I'll make a cut right at the faceplate location so I can inset the brass plate later on. To help the brass faceplate adhere better, I'll sand both mating surfaces with 80 grit sandpaper. Then I'll use some 5-minute epoxy to glue the brass plate to both sides of the walnut blank and clamp everything together nice and tight. Even though it's 5-minute epoxy, I'll let it cure overnight just to be sure it's fully set before moving on. The next day, I take the blank out of the clamps and mark the center on one end. I use my awl to get the precise center point. That's where the tailstock of the lathe will go. The other end of the blank will seat into the chuck I've already installed on the headstock. Next, I need to drill the hole for the threaded insert. Since the layout is already marked on the walnut blank, I'll use my awl to pinpoint the exact center of the location. Then I'll head over to the drill press and use a 3/8 inch brad point bit to bore the hole. Just a quick note here, I've already set the depth stop on the drill press, so I'm only going down 1 inch, which is the center point of the walnut blank. Now I'm going to install the brass threaded insert. To do that, I'll thread a 1/4 inch by 20 bolt into the insert and lock it in place with 2 nuts on the end. This gives me something solid to grab onto. Using a wrench, I'll screw the insert into the walnut blank. I've already drilled the hole to the correct depth, so the insert will sit about 1/4 inch below the surface. Once it's at the proper depth, I'll back out the bolt and nuts, leaving the insert seated in the blank. Then I'll screw in the knurled brass knob for a quick test fit, just to make sure everything is threading properly and working the way it should. With the walnut blank fully prepped, it's time to head over to the lathe. First, I'll use my calipers to measure the thread depth inside the 5/8 inch brass gas flare, which will become the ferrule on the end of the marking gauge. I'll transfer that measurement to the end of the blank to mark the depth of the tenon I need to turn. Then I'll begin shaping the blank. I'll use a parting tool to cut in the tenon and a roughing gouge to round out the rest of the blank. I'll alternate between the two, being careful not to build up too much heat on the brass faceplate. If the epoxy gets too warm, it can soften and weaken the bond. So take your time here. If the brass starts to feel hot, just pause and let it cool down. Finally, I'll set my calipers to the inside thread diameter of the gas flare fitting so I know exactly how much material to remove when turning the tenon. With the tenon cut to size, I'll go ahead and thread on the brass gas flare fitting. Using a ratchet, I'll carefully screw it onto the tenon until it seats snugly against the shoulder of the blank. Make sure it's tight, but whatever you do, don't over-tighten. You can snap the tenon clean off if you're not careful. Remember, brass is stronger than walnut, and it won't give you much warning before things go sideways. And don't ask me how I know. With the ferrule in place, it's time to drill an 8mm hole straight through the handle to accommodate the 8-inch steel beam. Take your time with this step, especially when drilling through the brass faceplate, to avoid heat buildup that could compromise the epoxy bond. Once the center hole is bored, I can begin shaping the handle. I'll use a combination of tools, my bowl gouge, roughing gouge, parting tool, and skew to shape it according to the profile I laid out earlier. At this point, the handle really starts to take shape. Next, I'll use a double cross-hatched file to start removing the sharp edges of the brass nut that's part of the gas flare fitting. The goal here is to round it over and blend it into the ferrule. Once I've got most of the nut shaped, I'll switch over to a fine file to smooth it out. Then I'll use my skew chisel to refine the flare end of the fitting and give it a nice clean transition into the wood. With the final shape dialed in on both the walnut and the brass, it's time to start sanding. I'll begin with 80 grit and work my way up through 120, 220, 400, and 600, finishing it off with a Scotch-Brite pad to give everything a silky smooth finish. With the turning complete, I'll remove the walnut blank from the lathe and head over to the bandsaw. I'll trim the end of the blank just proud of the brass faceplate, being careful not to cut into the brass. Then it's over to my Scary Sharp sanding system to flatten the faceplate. I start with 120 grit and work my way all the way up to 2500 grit for a mirror-like finish. As I begin sanding, you'll notice there's still a bit of epoxy residue on the brass. I'll keep sanding, and you can see from the scratch pattern that the edge isn't perfectly flat yet. This is a clear sign to keep going. Once the sanding marks are even and all moving in the same direction across the faceplate, you know it's flat and ready for the next grit. While I'm at it, I'll also sand a light chamfer around the entire edge of the brass faceplate at each grit. It's just enough to soften the edge, nothing aggressive, but it really gives it a clean, finished look and makes the tool feel great in the hand. Next, I'll grab one of the cutter blades from the kit and attach it to the end of the steel beam using the provided Phillips head machine screw. Then using my calipers, I'll measure the diameter of the cutter, being careful not to touch the cutting edge and risk dulling it. The measurement doesn't have to be exact, I just need a general idea so I can properly countersink the 8mm hole in the faceplate. The goal here is to allow the cutter blade to be retracted flush with or just below the brass faceplate when the tool's not in use. That way the blade stays protected and won't get damaged when it's sitting in the drawer or rolling around the bench. With the shaping done, I'll tape off the walnut using some painter's tape and head over to the buffing wheel to polish up the brass, just like I used to do with my military brass back in the day. Once it's clean enough to pass the supervisor's white glove inspection, I'll head back to the bench and reverse the process, this time taping off the brass so I can finish the walnut. My go-to finish is tung oil. I'll rub in a generous first coat and let it cure for 24 hours. After that, I'll give it a light sanding with some 4/0 steel wool and apply a second coat. Once that second coat is dry, I'll use more 4/0 steel wool to apply a final coat of Johnson's paste wax. Let that sit for about 20 minutes, then buff it out with a clean towel, and the finish is done. With the finish cured, it's time for the final assembly. I'll start by inserting the beam with the cutter head into the handle. Then I'll thread in the brass knurled knob, which locks the beam in place wherever you need it to lay out your joinery lines. Now the knob that came with the kit is intentionally a bit long, giving you some flexibility in your design, but in my case, I need to trim it down. So I measure the amount that's protruding, mark it off with some painter's tape, and clamp it in the vise. A few strokes with the hacksaw takes care of it. Then I'll smooth and round over the cut-in at the belt sander so it's comfortable to the touch. Finally, I can complete the installation and assembly of the marking gauge, and just like that, another handcrafted tool is born, one you'll use for a lifetime and maybe even pass down to the next generation. Now wait a minute, didn't I say earlier I'd be putting those extra parts from the kit to good use? And did I mention the kit was only 16 bucks? I'll drop a link in the description. So I had a piece of 1/4 inch brass rod left over from one of my previous builds. Might have been that handmade honing guide, or maybe the paring and skew chisels. Either way, I'm using it to build a second marking gauge, because let's be honest, 2 is good, but 3, well, that's a menage a trois, and let's just hope the supervisor isn't watching this part of the video. All jokes aside, having 2 marking gauges is actually really practical. You can keep one locked into a fixed setting for consistent layout lines and use the second one for your variable measurements. Saves time and a lot of back and forth. At the drill press, I clamped the brass rod vertically in a wooden screw clamp and drilled a shallow 1-inch hole about 1/4 of an inch deep. Then at the bench vise, I added a slight countersink, tapped it to match a small brass screw I had, and attached the cutter head. After that, I basically repeated the process from the first gauge. Didn't want to bore you with the same steps, but I did tweak the design slightly. I used the second threaded brass insert from the kit and scrounged up a spare 1/4 inch by 20 knurled knob left over from last week's sliding bevel gauge build. Worked like a charm. So that's it. Not just one, but 2 classic marking gauges. Made from brass, steel, and black walnut. Tools that are just as functional as they are beautiful. There's something special about using tools you've crafted yourself. They carry a little more meaning, and let's be honest, they just feel better in your hands. If you enjoyed the build, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. I've got more tool builds coming your way, and eventually we'll wrap up this whole series with a custom cabinet to store everything in one tiny spot. If you enjoyed this build and would like to support the channel, you can always leave us a super thanks. And you can always use the affiliate links. Everything helps support the channel. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. You know, nothing compares to the satisfaction you get when you make your own hand tools. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then please leave it a thumbs up and let me know what you thought in the comments. And if you decide to make one on your own, then please share it. I love to see what you guys make. Now, I'll leave links in the video description below to where you can pick up all the tools and equipment that I used on this build. And if you're new to the channel and you like DIY and woodworking projects, then I highly recommend that you smash that subscribe button. It's free and painless, and I'd also ask that you ring that bell icon. That way you'll be notified of all our upcoming videos. To all my existing subscribers, I really appreciate all the support you've given this channel. I'm Rick with the Engraving Workshop. Until next time, have a wonderful day, and God bless.